This is episode 50 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Paul Edmondson, Head of Research for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and co-editor with Stanley Wells of the Shakespeare Circle, an alternative biography. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Well, Shakespeare, like many actors and playwrights in his time, but also now as well, was really attuned to questions of space. Drama is a spatial art. Drama has to take place somewhere. And Shakespeare wrote for two theatres for the majority of his career, the Globe, and a bit later in his career, the Blackfriars.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When William Shakespeare was writing The Tempest, was he considering the light bouncing off the walls of the playhouse? When he directed Feste to be fond of singing in Twelfth Night, did Shakespeare know the people in the back would be able to hear him? We don't often think about Shakespeare's plays in context of where they were originally performed, but this week, our guest, Sarah Dustagheer, has written an entire book exploring that very question. It turns out many of Shakespeare's lines were written for the location where they were first to be performed. Sarah is a senior lecturer in early modern literature at the University of Kent and author of her latest book, Shakespeare's Playhouses, Repertory and Theatre Space at the Globe and the Blackfriars from 1599 to 1613. We are delighted to have Sarah visit with us here this week to take us inside Shakespeare's playhouses and explore the importance of venue in the performance of the Bard's plays. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Really nice to be here.
How much did Shakespeare's plays take into account where they were being performed? Was the plot designed to take up a certain venue?
Yeah, well, Shakespeare, like many actors and playwrights in his time, but also now as well, was really attuned to questions of space. Drama is a spatial art. Drama has to take place somewhere. And Shakespeare wrote for two theatres for the majority of his career, the Globe, and a bit later in his career, the Blackfriars. So really, my book is a response, thinking about his relationship and his response to these two theatres.
Now, in her book, Shakespeare's Two Playhouses, Repertory and Theatre Space at the Globe and the Blackfriars, Sarah discusses a very specific scene in The Duchess of Malfi, which, while that play was not done by William Shakespeare, it was done by one of his contemporaries. And Sarah, you describe a scene where the text uses the word dazzle, and she describes how it was only under original practice conditions inside a playhouse designed to mimic what it would have been like for William Shakespeare to perform there, that you discovered that word seems to not simply be descriptive, but rather intentional based on what happens in that scene when surrounded by candlelight. Sarah, will you please describe that scene for us and then share why you read this word differently when you understood the location where it was being performed?
Yeah, so The Duchess of Malfi is a wonderful tragedy written by John Webster. And in this play, Ferdinand orders the murder of his sister, who's the eponymous heroine of the play, and she's strangled on stage. And while she lies motionless, the servant who strangled her, Bosola, brings the brother on Ferdinand to have a look at his dead sister to see that the murder has taken place. Her brother looks at her, kind of inspects her body, and it's the beginning where he is starting to feel guilt-stricken, and he eventually does go mad. And he says to Bosola, her murderer, "Please cover her face. My eyes dazzle. She died young." And the word dazzle, we talk about people being dazzling as in dynamic and exciting and alluring, and the Duchess is all these things. But what I realised watching this play in performance at the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse in 2014 is that under the candlelight conditions of performance, the face of the actress who played the Duchess of Malfi, who had very light, kind of white, glistening powder on her face, using a kind of similar technique to that used in the period. Her face was literally dazzling. It was literally kind of shimmering under the candlelight. So there was a real link there between the play text, that particular word dazzle, and the conditions of performance. That suddenly made me realise the really importance of the performance conditions when we think about plays.
Now, to make this distinction in terms of performance conditions, we're referencing candlelight, and that was something specific for the Blackfriars that did not happen at the Globe. Sarah, could you explain why this is kind of a big deal?
Yeah, sure. So at the Globe is was an open-air theatre, and it was lit by daylight. So there's a big hole in the roof. So performances were from 2 o'clock in the afternoon and tended to finish around 5 o'clock in the evening. So entirely lit by daylight. The Blackfriars was an indoor theatre. It was a theatre that existed in what had been a hall in a medieval monastery that had been adapted into a theatre. And although we know that some daylight came in through very small windows, the majority of the lighting of the playhouse came from candles. So candles that were placed around the auditorium, but also probably around 5 chandeliers that hung above the stage in order to light the stage. So candlelight was the predominant form of lighting in indoor theatre, whereas daylight was the predominant form of lighting outdoors.
Now, the lighting was not the only thing that was specifically different between the Globe and the Blackfriars. Sarah's book talks about how not only was the language intentionally designed for the space it was in, but the costumes were designed for the types of audiences that would be in attendance at each location. How were the audiences different between the Globe and the Blackfriars?
Well, one thing we know about the admission prices for the Globe and the Blackfriars is that it's the 6 pennies at the Globe would buy you one of the best seats in the house, whereas the Blackfriars, 6 pennies was the minimum admission. And the reason for this difference in price was really the size of the two theatres. So the Globe held, we think, around 2,000 to 3,000 people, whereas the Blackfriars was a much smaller venue. The top end of the amount of people we think could be at the Blackfriars is around 900. So if you're a theatre maker, you've got fewer tickets to sell, you're going to raise the prices. So the Blackfriars, the minimum admission was more than at the Globe. And therefore we have a definitely economically more elite audience. In the past, scholars have been perhaps too quick to make a real polarisation between the Globe audience and the Blackfriars audience. We do know that wealthy people went to the Globe and the Blackfriars. We also know that at the Blackfriars, people did take their servants along with them. So we can't be too polarising, but broadly we can say that indoor theatre at Blackfriars, the audience was more economic and therefore socially elite. And what this meant in terms of the look of the theatre, coupled with the candlelight, the Blackfriars became a place where people came to show off their clothing. The very kind of wealthy, elite people would come. It would be like a catwalk, really, where people could come and show off the latest fashions that they were wearing. So whereas at the Globe under daylight, the conditions there are not as great for showing off your latest fashion as they were at the Blackfriars. There's very sort of different audiences at these two venues.
Did this carry over into the kind of costumes that would have been used on stage for, expensively dressed characters as well? Would they be different in one theater versus the other?
Yeah, absolutely. What I found in the book, what I talk about is that what I found is plays written for the Blackfriars are full of, probably have more costumes, more attention to the detail of costumes and more props that are there not to necessarily contribute to the narrative, but are about showing off or about display. What I suggested in the book is that plays at the Globe, if you have a prop at the Globe, it tends to be given a really significant meaning. So if you think about the ring in The Merchant of Venice, the prop keeps, or the handkerchief in Othello, it keeps being mentioned. It's really significant to the story. Whereas at the Blackfriars, props and costumes, which are beautiful looking, have kind of fleeting appearances. And for me, I think this is a reflection of what's happening in the auditorium. So if you have an audience that is glittering and glistening and looking fabulous under this candlelight, you have to have plays that kind of match that. And that's what we see at the Blackfriars, is more of a kind of visual display on stage in order to take advantage of the candlelight conditions.
Now, which plays were written for which locations? Give us some examples of Shakespeare's plays that were written for the Globe versus ones we think are written for the Blackfriars.
Well, sort of the key moment, the key year for thinking about Shakespeare and the Globe and the Blackfriars is around 1608, 1609. So from 1599 to 1608, 1609, the King's Men Shakespeare's Theatre Company were based at the Globe. In 1608, 1609, they have possession of the Blackfriars, and that's when we start to see Shakespeare and other playwrights for his company turn their attention to this indoor theatre. So at that point, we get a cluster of plays that some critics have called the romances or the late plays. So the Tempest, the Winter's Tale, Cymbeline. We also have Henry VIII, Shakespeare's collaborative play with John Fletcher. And those plays are marked by a particular musicality, for example. And one thing we know about the Blackfriars is that because it was indoor, and the acoustics were very different, and the acoustics were far more suitable for a range of instruments that would have been lost at the Globe in terms of it being an outdoor space, that certain instruments, you wouldn't have been able to hear them. Whereas the Blackfriars, a whole range of instruments were used. And Shakespeare really takes advantage of that. So suddenly his plays become especially attuned to music. And so the Tempest is a really wonderful example. So you think about the amount of singing, Ariel singing in the Tempest, the mask that happens in the Tempest as well. There's real musicality to his plays at that point. The other thing that happens, if we think about a play like Henry VIII, Henry VIII explores Reformation history, it explores England's past, and it does so in a theatre, the Blackfriars, which had been a monastery and which actually had been the site for the divorce of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. And what Shakespeare does in Henry VIII is to restage that divorce. It's a wonderful piece of almost site-specific theatre. He restages those events in the very location in which they took place. So there's lots of ways in which he's suddenly really attuned and thinking about the Blackfriars.
Now, tell us about stage practices. I want to compare stage practices specifically at the Globe versus the Blackfriars. And I'm going to ask about the Globe first. And I know you mentioned music, but there were a lot of special effects that happened on stage for William Shakespeare's plays. And what were some of the ones that would have been used at the Globe, but not the Blackfriars, for example?
Well, one thing I noted in the book that I explored in my research was the use of sound effects. And by that, I mean things like alarms, so sort of military alarms and clock sounds and bells and thunder and lightning. And what I noticed in the Globe was that the repertory of plays performed there are just full of really loud sound effects. Now, the Globe was a wonderful acoustic instrument for really loud sounds. They worked really, really well in that space. Whereas if you'd done those sorts of sounds at the Blackfriars, it wouldn't have been really pleasant for an audience there. Those sound effects would have been too jarring, I think, in confined indoor space. But at the Globe, they worked really well. And so the plays are marked by what I called a poetics of sound, in the sense of sound effects begin to be woven into narrative in really interesting ways. And also, I think that's something to do with the nature of the Globe audience, in the sense of there were many people in the Globe. There were over between 2,000 and 3,000 people. It was a very social atmosphere. We know from contemporary accounts that people were often doing anything but watching a play. They were socialising, talking, flirting. Therefore, I think sometimes sound effects were used by playwrights to really refocus attention, really kind of shock and awe and bring the audience back into the world of the play in really dramatic ways. So, for example, we can think about the opening Macbeth, Thunder and Lightning. That's a really fantastic way to open a play at the Globe, really acoustically drawing in everyone's attention. Another wonderful scene that uses sound effects in a kind of auditory focusing way is in Othello, where we have the scene where Cassio gets very drunk and, orchestrated via Iago, has a fight with Roderigo. And that scene is very, very chaotic. There's a fight, people have been drinking, singing songs. So it's kind of very, very chaotic. And at the end of that scene, what we have is an alarm bell ringing, a constant ringing of a bell. That seems to really, really kind of refocus, kind of make everyone focus in again. And of course, that's the moment where Othello appears. Othello appears to assert his authority. And one thing Othello says is, please stop that horrible alarm going off. Please stop that bell ringing, because it's really, really insistent. So there's a way in which playwrights start to think about how to use sound effects and auditory effects in their writing at the Globe.
So when they start performing, and I think you said 1609 at the Blackfriars, what is changing for them when they bring their repertoire into this space? Was it necessary to write new plays for the space because what they had done at the Globe wouldn't work there?
Not necessarily, because one of the things that I discovered in writing this book is that, one of the things that I believe is that even though a play might be written for a particular venue, that doesn't mean it's only tied to that venue. Theatre companies were really adept at moving from place to place. So we know that they could adapt and perform plays in multiple venues. And we know from our own experience of watching plays, and anyone who's performed in plays knows that when you perform a play in a different venue, it's just that the space you perform in makes the play mean and experience in different ways. That's one of the joys of drama and plays, that there is a lovely interaction between space and play. So not necessarily, they didn't have to write new plays. And one thing we know is that they took plays from their existing Globe repertory and performed them at the Blackfriars. And suddenly I think those plays had a new resonance and a new meaning. So Othello is a really great example of a play that was written for the Globe. We know that it was written before they had the Blackfriars. But if you think about the lovely imagery of darkness and light in that play, performed under candlelight conditions, and you think about the kind of intimacy of the final scenes in Othello's bedroom in an indoor, smaller venue, you can see how suddenly that play has different resonances. And I wonder how far Shakespeare and his theatre company were looking back at the plays they had and said, oh, wow, that play would work really great at the Blackfriars. But kind of thinking about new things they wrote, I think they did start to think about this new exciting venue that they had in front of them. They'd worked at the Globe for at least 10 years. They knew that playhouse, they knew how to work it. They had a new wonderful venue to play with, and it doesn't surprise me that Shakespeare and other playwrights would think, oh wow, I'm going to really focus my attention on this new theatre. So you suddenly get things like musicality, as I mentioned, but also I talked about this idea of glittering and glistening costume. Suddenly you get lots and lots of focus on costume, lots of props of jewellery, lots of props of things like pearl appearing in their repertory that clearly takes advantage of the visual environment of the Blackfriars. And also, as I mentioned, you get engagement with Reformation history for this previously medieval space. So there's a real sense, I think, in catering for this new venue, in the knowledge that they really knew the Globe well and they could adapt plays.
So you're basically talking about the idea, and you mentioned this in your book as well, where the reality for Shakespeare when he was performing plays and the theater industry in the early modern period was they weren't simply performing them at the Globe or at the Blackfriars. It was a variety of places. They'd be called to court. They were also performing in churches and inns and even marketplaces. These plays had to function at a variety of places. But what your research seems to show is that they had a home or a place where it worked best or was an ideal situation for that particular play. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I think, because it's very difficult for us because we're used to theatres. We're used to the concept that we have these buildings that are purposely built for the use of drama. But of course, in Shakespeare's time, that concept really only began in the beginning of the 16th century. The dominant mode was performing plays and adapting them to multiple venues, not having a place to call home. Shakespeare's career is really the beginning of theatre companies being based in London and based in particular venues for extended periods of time. What I'm suggesting here is that adaptability was in the DNA of early modern actors and early modern playwrights. That's something that they knew really well.
Well, I wanted to specifically address the adaptability here. My personal experience with being an actor in theater settings is limited, but I have been in the situation where you perform one play at one location and then you're performing it again at another location. And there was an extensive amount of rehearsal time that got dedicated to what are we going to do now that we're in a different place, because your entrances and your exits change and the way that you cross the stage at different points changes. And while I don't know what the performance schedule at the Blackfriars was, I have read that plays were often performed daily at the Globe. And I'm curious how the actors for Shakespeare managed to go from one venue to another without anything close to the kind of rehearsal times we have today for theater.
Well, I think partly it was because they had that inbuilt adaptability. But secondly, although I'm interested in the difference between the Globe and the Blackfriars, of which I think there are many, the basic stage architecture was similar in the sense of you had a left-hand entrance, a right-hand entrance, a central opening, a trapdoor below, a trapdoor above. The stage size was different, much, much bigger at the Globe than at the Blackfriars. But I think they had the basic stage architecture to work with, and that may have been possible to replicate in other venues too. So I think they had a kind of generalist basis on which to work. And as I said, I think they were actors who were very, very adept at working in a way that was perhaps less polished than modern actors are, but certainly was part of the enjoyment of being and watching early modern drama was probably some of that adaptability and some of that unknowability from a first performance in a new venue.
I have to think the repertoire format here of having an established company of players who work together on all of these plays helped in this situation because you did kind of understand your fellow actors and what they were going to do. You were familiar with the material, so probably making the small shifts you would need to make between different venues wasn't as difficult as we might think of it today, where even though a single actor has performed several different plays, they haven't necessarily performed it with this cast.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've got a group of actors who know each other really well, who are performing plays that they know really well, and also working in character types that they know well. So we certainly did have actors. So Richard Burbage, for example, was the lead actor in Shakespeare's company. There were probably actors who always played the roles of women, actors who always played the clown. So you've got a real familiarity in terms of acting. So therefore, you perhaps got headspace as an actor to allow for a bit more flexibility in terms of your use, you're focusing on how you're using the space and what you're doing. But in some ways, thinking about that idea of not being so polished, one of the things that the modern Globe has shown us is that sense of real liveness and actors interacting with audiences, and almost every performance being slightly different because of the characterization of the audience and that possible interaction. I think it's a very different form of theatre to the one that we're used to seeing nowadays.
And we have only begun to scratch the surface of the incredible research Sarah has compiled in her book on this question of performance in space. And while I will list your book in the show notes for today's episode, Sarah, I'm hoping that you can point us to some additional resources, maybe even some of the ones that you used to compile your book, that we should definitely check out if we want to learn more about the significance of performance space on staging Shakespeare's plays?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of titles I definitely recommend. First of all, one of the things about the book and my research is that I use a lot of examples from the performance of Shakespeare's plays in modern reconstructions like Shakespeare's Globe and the Blackfriars in Stanton, Virginia, and that there are two collections of essays actually that I found really helpful. So Paul Menzer has edited a collection of essays called Inside Shakespeare, Essays on the Blackfriars Stage, that are all responses to the reconstructed Blackfriars in Virginia. Also, Farah Kareem Cooper and Christy Carson's Shakespeare's Globe, a Theatrical Experiment, which has a collection of essays not only by academics, but by theatre practitioners, people like Mark Rylance, people like Tim Carroll, who talk about their experience of using the Globe stage. I found that really helpful to hear from actors and directors in terms of using how they responded to the space. Another area that I became really interested in doing the book that really informed my thinking was critical work about contemporary performance, so the discipline that we now know as performance studies. And there's a really wonderful book called Space in Performance, Making Meaning in the Theatre by Gay Macaulay, that is a general book about theatre and space that I found incredibly useful just to think about some of these ideas about how actors, directors and audiences respond to the space of the theatre. And then finally, just two books that aren't about professional theatre in this period, but about different spaces that were equally as important. So one of them, Jeanette Dillon, The Language of Space in Court Performance, is all about not only plays, but things like masks and even executions and trials. How in this period, people were very alive to how space was used and how space was used in a very formal setting and how where people positioned in space was really important. That's a really great book. And finally, a book called Playing Spaces in Early Women's Drama by Alison Findlay. We really focus on the professional stage, lots of male playwrights, or entirely male playwrights. But during this time also, there were aristocratic women generally who wrote plays for performances in their households. And Findlay's work looks at how they use those very domestic spaces. So that's two sort of wonderful examples of non-theatrical but very highly performative space and how that's used in the period.
Excellent resources. We will link to those in today's show notes so we can check those out further. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, this is just an impossible choice for someone who works in English literature, and I'm torn between two. But I've come down. My first instinct was I just adore John Milton's Paradise Lost. I just think it's a wonderful text, and I thought, they could do some wonderful comparison between the Bible and Shakespeare. But also, if I hadn't gone into studying Shakespeare, my heart very much lies in Victorian literature, and my ultimate favourite novel is George Eliot's Middlemarch, and I think I'm going to come down and say George Eliot's Middlemarch. I would take that to my desert island.
Excellent choice for sure. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm doing something that's quite exciting. I'm working on a dictionary of all Shakespeare's references to London. So this is for a series that is published by Arden Shakespeare, and there have been several dictionaries. There's been Shakespeare in Medicine, Shakespeare in Law, Shakespeare in Military Language. What it involves is reading the entire canon and finding all the references to a particular subject. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. So I've reread the entire canon, and I found all the references to specific London locations, and I'm working on putting that dictionary together, which for the first time will give us a topography of the actual places that Shakespeare mentions in his plays. And it's been really interesting to see not only the places that are mentioned, but also how Shakespeare uses them and how it affects his language and his imagery. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. Please keep us updated on that when it becomes available. We'd love to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Sarah Dustagheer, author and professor of Shakespeare, thank you so much for being here with us today and discussing the Blackfriars and the Globe. It's been a joy to have you.
Great. Thank you so much.
To see even more history about the Globe and the Blackfriars, including the references that Sarah provided for us today as recommended resources where you can go to learn more, all of that extra history that didn't fit in the episode, along with her resources, are listed in the show notes. You can find that and a map of locations for Shakespeare's plays. Now, I haven't put one together about London and the locations that Sarah said her latest research is going to be on, but I did put together one that outlines all of the locations for Shakespeare's plays around the world. It's called A Map of Shakespeare's World. You can download that by joining the newsletter for That Shakespeare Life, and the link for that is found in the show notes for today's episode as well. Find all these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 50. That's CassidyCash.com/EP50. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.